Hello and welcome to my channel, Ideas Have Consequences. My name is Gordon Wilson, and as you can tell, the setting for this video is changed. I'm outside. This is October the 9th, 2019, and it's a nice warm day, and so I decided that rather than be stuck inside in my office, I'd just as soon come out here and do this. Well, the video that I'm doing is one that I promised from the last video, and that's going to be on the subject of suicide. Suicide is not an easy subject to talk about. It affects a lot of people. I have people that are close to me that have had to deal with this issue of suicide when someone very close to them decided to end their own life. Suicide is a complicated issue because it primarily comes from, it's a mental illness, of course, but sometimes that mental illness is caused biologically. That is, individuals are just born with a predisposition to depression. I'm one of those people. For me, it started when I was in my adolescence, probably around 14 or 15, somewhere in that vicinity. And fortunately, at the time, it was not long-lasting. It would come in about 2-week cycles, and there was really no rhyme or reason to when it would happen. But I became aware as about 14, 15 that I would be, I'd have these onsets of just, I didn't want to associate with anybody. I didn't want to talk to anybody. I just wanted to be alone. I lived on a farm, so that was pretty easy done because there were a lot of open fields. There were forests around me. We also had open pit mining in the area where I lived, and so there were a lot of abandoned roads that one could walk down. These were roads that had been used to haul coal out of the mines. So as I say, fortunately they didn't last all that long. They lasted about 2 weeks. But as I grew older, the depression set in more and more, and they lasted longer and longer till eventually it just set in and wouldn't go away. When I was younger, I found that I had enough energy that I could overcome these depressive episodes, and did. But eventually they got so bad that they became so debilitating. I couldn't do anything. And the subject of suicide certainly entered my brain at that time. But I didn't. And I'm going to tell you why as we progress along in this video. So that's one factor in why people get depressed. The other thing is some people, it's situational. So they don't have any predisposition. There's no mental illness in terms of biological. The situation occurs because of circumstances. And then they go into depressions. And fortunately, in those particular cases, the medication that they have to take, if they need to take any at all, is only for short term until they break the cycle of depression and are able to get back on the normal path of life without this besetting sadness that just overtakes you. I've been on medication now, I really can't remember, 15, 20 years, something like that. I'm 67, just had my 67th birthday here not too long ago. So I've been on medication now for quite a long time. Now, fortunately for me, I found an antidepressant that has very little side effects, and that's not always the case for a lot of people. I've been taking mine long enough now that I really am not aware of any particular side effects from it at all, other than it allows me to stay on an even keel. Of course, like anybody else, I am susceptible to the circumstances in which I find myself, and I'm never sure that when those difficult times come along, if they are made worse by the fact that I do have this proclivity to, or this medical condition that will just, I will go into depression if I don't take my pills. And the reason I know that is I've tried to go off the pills a number of times in the past, and I've done that when life has been good. I've had no particular reason to feel depressed, but nevertheless, depression came on me. Now, it's interesting that back in the 50s, I was born in 1952. Back in the 50s and the early part of the 60s, the issue of depression and suicide was so insignificant that people or drug companies really didn't want to spend the money in developing antidepressants because there simply weren't enough cases that they felt they could get their investment back for the development. But by 1980, the early part of the 1980s, and I remember this because I was in university and studying social work, that suicide among young adults was the second leading cause of death. So from the 60s, early 60s to the 80s, we've had that dramatic change. And suicide has just been increasing ever since. I'm not sure that it's the same between Canada and the United States. I suspect that it's more the same than the articles that I've read would indicate. In the United States, they suggest there's been a 15% increase in the rate of suicide over the last, 5 to 7 years, 5 to 10 years. And there's never been any articles that I could come across that would indicate such a dramatic rise here in Canada. Nonetheless, when you look at the statistics, the rates are about the same. Now, another interesting phenomenon with this issue of suicide, when you look at the stats between the ages of 10 and 14 years of age, the rate of suicide in boys and girls is the same, and fortunately it is relatively low. But once you get into the adolescence, and the next age group is of course 15 to 19, in that age group we've seen a dramatic rise in the rate of suicide. And also in this age group we see a dramatic difference in the number of boys and the number of girls that commit suicide. The number of men that commit suicide is on average 4 times as many as for women that commit suicide. Sorry, I'm not paying attention to my phone that I'm holding here, and just looking off to this nice view that I'm looking at. So I'll try to be a little more conscious of looking at this phone. So the problem of suicide is much more dramatic for men than it is for women, although it's awful for both, that life gets so bad that you would rather die than live. And as I say, I've been there. I can remember 1-2 year period that I just woke up virtually every day, and I was I would have been in my late 40s when that happened, and I woke up virtually every day, and the first thought that went through my head was probably, damn, I'm still living. And of course I thought about ending my own life, but at that point I was married, had children, and I knew that my son struggled with many of the same things that I did. And one of the reasons that prevented me from acting on this desire was I simply didn't want to give my son that option. I didn't want him ever to be at the place where he would say to himself, well, Dad did it, so I can do it too. So that was one of the preventative reasons that I didn't commit suicide. But it wasn't the only reason. Now, what happened in terms of lifestyle and environment between the 50s, when depression and suicide hardly made a statistical blip, to where we are now in 2019, when suicide for some age groups is the leading cause of death. There were a couple of articles that I came across and had on my news broadcast. I'm a news director for a radio station here in the city of Fredericton. Now, this is a very small radio station, and I have a staff of one, and you're listening to them right now. So, an auspicious title, director of, or news director, when in fact the title is relatively meaningless, because I go out and get my own news. But what changed? Why are young people today so prone to taking their own lives? Why do they see life as being so difficult and so hurtful that the thought of continuing on is worse than ending your life right now? So we're going to look at that. And in order to look at the statistics and the quotes that I want to give you, they're on my computer. And as you can tell, I'm not at my computer. So we'll pick this up when I'm done enjoying this sunshine. And we'll give you the lowdown on what's happened in society, why suicide is so much more prevalent today. All right, we'll be back. Well, the sun's gone down, as you can see out the window behind me here. But it was nice while it lasted. Okay, so we're going to talk about some of the stats that I have uncovered with regard to suicide. Yesterday there was an article on the CBC website, and this is about a young man of 35 years of age. And for some of you that won't be young, but for me it is. And I want to read just a short portion of that article. It's much too long to read the whole thing, but it'll give you the sense of what this young man went through. On August 29th, the night before Kevin Blair was found dead by suicide, Darren McCarthy and Michelle Dempsey asked Fredericton police to perform a wellness check on their friend. A check was made, and they were told Kevin would spend the night in hospital, but he didn't stay the night. Kevin texted Darren and Michelle, his girlfriend, to say he went home just 20 minutes after arriving, and he was going to try to kill himself. Darren said he asked for another wellness check, and an officer found Kevin safe, albeit emotional. He found him at home. An appointment was arranged with the crisis worker for the following morning, and Kevin was left alone for the night, and that was a bad decision. That's my interjection. The next day, Darren and Michelle received an email from Kevin. As they read it, they knew it was too late. Their friend was gone. The email was sent on a time delay, ensuring there would be no attempt to intervene. It was a suicide letter, 35 pages, of how the mental health system failed the 35-year-old, how it didn't do anything for him, how he could manipulate it. After month-long struggles to save him, Kevin's friends are left questioning how he slipped through the cracks. They're now calling for changes in what they see as a flawed, under-resourced system unable to help a man who became determined to end his life. There's a lot of people that are crying for help, and they're not getting the help, and there's a problem, said Darren. We have to find the problem and try to address it to prevent this from happening again. With regard to healthcare systems in general, it is often said we need to spend more time preventing illness in the first place rather than just curing it. And, sorry, these are my words. Regarding suicide in particular, the one thing almost everyone who writes or speaks about the subject points to a dramatic rise in the number of attempted and successful suicides. With regard to Darren or Kevin's complaint about the healthcare system being not very good here in the province of New Brunswick, well, he's right. I've been through the system, and it's the skill level of the people that are there is it's at the lower end of the cycle. I'm not sure where these people would have passed what kind of grade they would have had when they passed their courses, but I suspect most of them were below 50%. I was a Baptist minister for 15 years, and that was over 15 years ago now. And I took courses on how to do counseling. I took courses on psychology and social work. So I'm pretty familiar with the literature, and of course I did a lot of personal study. I was fortunate in that I took a course on how to conduct interviews in counseling, and I took it from two of the top-notch interview skilled people. I've never encountered anybody with their skill level since that course that I took. But you expect when you go into professionals that you're going to get top-notch professional people. And unfortunately, here in Fredericton, the province of New Brunswick, that's not what you get. The other problem that you get is that most of the psychiatrists are not English speaking, that English is not their first language, and it's very difficult to understand what they have to say. With regard to Kevin and falling through the cracks, he didn't fall through any crack. He fell through a huge hole, because proper treatment of depression involves both a medical, getting on some kind of medication, as well as the appropriate counseling. And all of the studies point to that. You need to have both if you're going to maximize your possibilities of success. I wanted to just read to you an article. I've already covered this, but it's interesting. When I was outside, I didn't have this in front of me, but I want to read it to you. I think you'll find it interesting. It's an article from psychologysalon.com. That's the website, psychologysalon.com. And the author is Dr. Randy Patterson. And this comes out of a much longer article, and I've only got a couple of paragraphs here. He writes, in the 1950s, Roland Kuhn identified an apparent antidepressant effect of the drug imipramine. Given what we know about depression in the 21st century, it is tempting to guess that the drug companies must have been over the moon with greedy excitement. Not so. Clinical depression was regarded as a relatively small problem, unlikely to result in sufficient sales to recoup the cost of drug development and testing. Nevertheless, pharmaceutical company Ciba went forward, and imipramine became the first of the tricyclic antidepressants on the market. And that's where I got the information when I told you about how low suicides were and depression was in the 1950s. So now I've got my statistics here in front of me, and these are statistics from Canada. And here's the rates of suicide as of 2012. In 10 to 14-year-olds, the rate is 1.8 person per 100,000 people. And that's 1.8. For 15 to 19-year-olds, that jumps to 10.2 persons per 100,000. And then the 20 to 24-year-olds, it's 21.1 per 100,000. And that's where it seems to peak, and then the numbers start dropping after that. Now, I told you also that after you get past age 14, the rate of suicide increases dramatically for men as compared to women. In 2012, again, this is where these numbers come from, in the age group from 10 to 14, there were 34 suicides in Canada. In that age group, 17 male, 17 female. And then when you move into the next category of 15 to 19-year-olds, that 34 jumps to 227. So as you can see, there is a dramatic increase when you move into the next age category. And in that category, the split is 160 men who commit suicide as opposed to 67 women. So it's almost 100 more men than women committed suicide. In the age group 20 to 24, and as I mentioned, this is the age group with the highest rate of suicide, there was a total of 291 suicides, people in that age group. The number of men is 221, the number of women 70. Then we start to see the rates start to go down. So from 25 to 29, there are 273 as opposed to 291. But in this age group, again, there's 217 men who've committed suicide and 56 women. And there's the breakdown goes right up to 90 and older, and I'm not going to read them all, but I will give you the totals. So in the year 2012, in Canada, there were 3,926 suicides. The breakdown in that grouping is, for men, there were 2,972 suicides, and for women, there were 954. Now, whether you're talking men or whether you're talking women, it's too high. But the fact of the matter is the problem is significantly worse for men. So what has happened between what was going on in the 50s and what is going on now? Dr. Jean Twenge, I think that's how you pronounce her last name, Twenge, is a social psychologist at San Diego State University and is the author of Generation Me, Why Today's Young Americans Are More Confident, Assertive, Entitled, and More Miserable Than Ever Before. She's published a number of articles on that subject, and here's her conclusion. I think the research tells us that modern life is not good for mental health, she said. Newsweek in May of 2013 published an article, Why Suicide Has Become an Epidemic and What We Can Do to Help. There's just one paragraph out of this article that I want to read. And it says, throughout the developed world, for example, self-harm is now the leading cause of death for people 15 to 49, surpassing all cancer and heart disease around the world. In 2010, self-harm took more lives than war, murder, and natural disasters combined. Now, just let me read that for you again. Around the world in 2010, self-harm took more lives than war, murder, and natural disasters combined, stealing more than 36 million years of healthy life across all ages. And when you start looking at those kinds of numbers across Western society, as compared to what it used to be in the 50s, then the question really needs to be asked, what has changed? Something has had to change to make that dramatic increase in the rate of suicides to being at a place where it is hardly a statistical blip, to a place now where it has become the leading cause of death among certain age groups. The title of my channel is called Ideas Have Consequences. And as I told you, I was born in the 50s, so my schooling took place. I entered the school system at age 6, and that would have been 1958, and I graduated from high school in 1971. Should have come out in 1970, but I liked grade 11 so much I decided I'd do that one twice. There was a significant change in ideology from the 50s to now. We need to talk about worldview. We need to talk about what a worldview is and the impact that it has on our lives and how we look at life. And that's what a worldview is. It is that sum total of experience and knowledge that has created a concept in our brains that this is what life is about, and we make our decisions based on that worldview. Now, for most of us, a worldview is hardly ever considered. It just is. And everybody has one, because without it, you simply can't function. I listened to a lecture by a professor by the name of Dallas Willard, and I think he taught at the University of Southern California. He passed away a few years ago now, but this was a lecture that he gave to students. It wasn't at his university, it was at another one. I just forget which one it was now, but he's dealing with this subject of worldview, and he uses this example. He asked the question of the students there. He said, how many of you on your way to this lecture tonight worried about being eaten by a dinosaur? Well, of course, nobody did, because dinosaurs don't exist. But his point was, even though you never thought about that, it still played a part in your worldview. So things that we don't consider affect our worldview. And most specifically, the most important concept that you and I can think about is the concept of God. In 1950, in the community in which I grew up, just about everybody went to church. Whether we practiced all of the teachings of the church or not was a different matter, but we went. And as a child, I was sent to Sunday school. Well, I was taken to Sunday school. And in Sunday school, I learned the biblical stories of David and Goliath, of Samson and his strength, of the parting of the Red Sea. And I learned about Jesus and what he taught. And virtually everybody in that period of time would have been knowledgeable, at least the very basics of Christianity. And Christianity, the teachings of Jesus and the New Testament and the Old Testament, was the greatest influence for us developing a worldview. That's not the case today. We live in a practical atheistic society. Whether you are consciously aware of it or not, almost everything that you encounter is designed to make you believe in materialism. That is, that everything that is real can be touched or felt or seen. And if you can't do any of those things, it doesn't exist. And since God does not have any of those qualities, then God doesn't exist. And our educational system, both in public school and at universities, that is the underlying implication of what is being taught. So God is very rarely ever mentioned, but the fact that he is hardly ever mentioned, and if he is mentioned, mostly it is in a negative context, then that goes a long way to help us dispel the notion about God. That has had profound impact on people's lives. And that is now, I'm going to let you listen to a part of it's a video that was put out by Dr. William Lane Craig. Dr. Craig is a philosopher, a well-regarded philosopher, by the way. He has debated scientists and skeptics for years and years and years. As a matter of fact, on one atheist website that I happened to stumble upon, one of the sections on that website was how to defeat William Lane Craig in a debate. They listed about 15 or so debates that Dr. Craig had had at that point. And as far as the owner of this website was concerned, Dr. Craig had won them all. I haven't watched a whole lot of Dr. Craig's debates, but the ones that I have watched, he was clearly the class of the field. So I'm going to play for you this video that Dr. Craig has produced about the absurdity of life without God.
Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? In the name of progress, modern man has tried to answer those questions without reference to God. But the answers that came back were not exhilarating, but dark and terrible. You are the accidental byproduct of nature. There is no reason for your existence. All you face is death. Modern man thought that in killing God, he had freed himself from everything that repressed and stifled him. Instead, he discovered that in killing God, he had unwittingly killed himself. For if God does not exist, man's life is ultimately absurd. If God does not exist, then man and the universe are inevitably doomed to death. Like all biological organisms, man must die. His life is but a spark in the infinite darkness, a spark that appears, flickers, and then dies forever. Scientists tell us that the universe is expanding, and as it does so, it grows colder and colder. Eventually, there will be no heat at all. There will be no light. There will be no life. This is not science fiction. If God does not exist, then we are inevitably doomed to extinction. Now, what does all this imply? It means that life itself is absurd. It means that the life we do have is ultimately without meaning, value, or purpose.
Now, in the next 5 minutes.
If each individual person passes out of existence when he dies, what ultimate significance can be assigned to his life? His life might be important relative to certain other events, but if all of the events are ultimately meaningless, what can be the ultimate significance of influencing any of them? Mankind is thus no more ultimately significant than a swarm of mosquitoes, for their end is all the same. This is the horror of modern man. Because he ends in nothing, he ultimately is nothing. But it gets even more distressing, for if life ends at the grave, It makes no ultimate difference whether you live as Joseph Stalin or as a Mother Teresa. If your destiny is ultimately unrelated to your behavior, then you may as well just live as you please. Moral values are either just expressions of personal taste or else the byproducts of biological evolution and social conditioning. Who's to say whose values are right and whose are wrong? Now think of what that means. It means that it is impossible to condemn war, oppression, or crime as evil. To kill someone or to love someone is morally equivalent. Our predicament is that it is impossible to live consistently and happily with such a worldview. The atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell held that moral values are simply expressions of personal taste. And yet Russell admitted that he could not live that way. He therefore found his own worldview, and I quote, "incredible. I do not know the solution," he confessed. If death stands with open arms at the end of life's trail, then what is the goal of life? Is there no reason for life? If its destiny is a cold death in the recesses of outer space, then the answer is yes, it is pointless. We need to wake up and understand the gravity of the alternatives before us. If God exists, then there is hope for man. But if God does not exist, then all we are left with is despair. Faced with an atheistic worldview, the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre realized that life is absurd. In his play, No Exit, he tragically portrayed the life of man as hell. The final words of the play might serve as an atheistic mantra. Well, let's get on with it.
Now that clip that you just saw from Dr. William Lane Craig is taken from a lecture that he gave some years prior to that, which was much longer, and I will include a link to the original lecture so that you can listen to the whole thing. I said I was going to give you the other reason that I didn't commit suicide when I was going through all those depressive events. Well, you see, for me, there is a real God. God is not some kind of abstract entity out there that I have the privilege of devising however I want him to be. And that is so frequently the case that we have today. People have not stopped being spiritual, is the word that they use. Most people still believe in God. However, they've lost faith in the church and they've gone away from the church. I've had my moments when I wasn't feeling very fond of the church. At age 19, I was going through a crisis, and I turned my life over to the Jesus that I learned about when I went to Sunday school. Something happened. It was a dark night. I was walking on the road. There were no cars. There was no moon. There was lots of stars. And I was at a crisis point because I was graduating and I was heading off into the world. And I really didn't know where I was going and what I would accomplish when I got there. And so at that crisis point, I looked up into the stars and believed there had to be a God. And I said, if you're there, if you really exist, then I'm going to turn my life over to you to follow your leading in my life. And something happened. Now, you can say that was just a psychological experience, but you would be wrong, because this experience that I had is replicated millions of times over all around the world when people come to the place where I came. I'm a born skeptic, so even though I made that commitment, and even though I had a life-altering experience, I still had my skepticism, and I wanted to find some empirical evidence to substantiate what I experientially believed. And so from the age of 19 to now at age 67, I have spent my life looking at empirical data to support the teaching of the church and what the church contends to be true. See, I don't believe in an abstract God. I believe in a real God that the New Testament and the Old Testament talk about. I believe he's a God that cares about us. I believe that he is a God that is so powerful that he can keep track of all of us and love all of us equally. That's the teaching of the Bible. If you don't believe in God, then you're, as Dr. Craig pointed out, you're a evolutionary accident. Your life has no meaning except the meaning that you can create for it. But between the ages of 15 and 49, especially between the ages of 15 and 25, you have a time of transition when you're moving away from your home to establish your new life. And a lot of crises tend to occur during that period of time. And if you have a worldview that says, I'm on my own, whatever has happened in your life at that point has forever ruined the possibility of any future for you, the hurt that you're feeling inside, the despair that you're feeling inside is so great that you decide, well, there's just no point in going on. My life is an accident anyway. I have no particular usefulness in this world. Rather than continue to feel this despair that I am experiencing right now, I think I'll just end it. Well, I've had those periods of despair because of my medical condition where I am prone to depression, and also because I have attention deficit disorder. I made some bad decisions that caused a lot of problems in my life. But I was always aware that God was there to guide me through it. Part of my worldview is that I am not an accident, that I was purposefully created by God, and that all of the experiences that I went through, both good and bad, have been allowed by God to make me become the man that I am today. I believe that is true for you. I do not believe, regardless of whether you believe in God or not, I believe that you were created by God for a reason, that your life is not an accident. And I would encourage you to, if you haven't given serious consideration to the teaching of the Christian church, that you do so. You don't need to necessarily start going to church, but buy yourself a good Bible. The latest translation is the English Standard Version. It's very readable. When you buy that Bible, don't start reading in the Old Testament. Start reading in the New Testament. And if you start with Matthew, in the very beginning of Matthew, it's going to go through a lot of genealogies. We'll just skip through that section until you get to where the narrative really begins, and Matthew begins with the narrative around the birth of Jesus. But Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, none of those are very long. You can read them in about 15-20 minutes. Do so. Don't just read a chapter and quit. Read the whole thing. In fact, take the time to read all 4 of them, because they will give you a sense of who Jesus is, who he was when he lived on this earth, and what he wants for you. Then find yourself a good Bible-believing church, a pastor that you can relate to, that you can ask questions of, that will answer the hard questions, because there are answers. I've spent from 19 to 67 looking for those answers, and while I haven't found them all, I think I have found a good many of them, certainly enough to convince me that what I believe is real. It is not some kind of fairy tale. It is not some kind of mystical belief that I use just to make me feel better. I have solid evidence that the teaching of the Christian church is a real, we're talking about a real person, Jesus. We're talking about a real God who created all there is. So, this video has gone on an awful lot longer than I thought it would. Thank you for listening. I hope this has been somewhat helpful for you. Please feel free to send feedback if you have questions. If you're a skeptic and you have questions, then ask the questions. I don't pretend that I'm going to have all of the answers for you, but I have developed a good resource base that I can probably find those answers. So let me encourage you to do so. That ends this video. I'll continue to produce videos looking at our society, where things are going, and why I believe they are going the way they are. And so now you know that I'll be doing that from a Christian perspective. And I will try to give you a good, solid, reasoned arguments that are not, I won't be quoting the Bible to you. I will be looking at evidence that is available out there, evidence that has been researched by good scholars who examine these kinds of things, and I'll try to pull this all together for you so that you can help understand why our world is going the way that it's going. Anyway, that's enough for me. Thank you for listening. I look forward to hearing from you. Until the next video, hope things go well.